So I told President Xi when we met at the G20 in Brazil in 2024 that we want to build a consistent, long-term, comprehensive and strategic relationship with China. We did have a good meeting, and a long meeting as well. We had the formal parts, we had some informal parts, and then we continued over lunch. And so the relationship is in a good place, a strong place. And what I'd say to everybody here is that I always act in our national interest. And therefore the question for me is, how does this accelerate and deliver back at home? I know that whatever's going on in the world, the most important thing to the vast majority of people is the cost of living. So opening up access to business, opportunities, seizing those opportunities, which then gets reflected in better businesses, in jobs, in price reductions at home, really, really matter. And so we made real progress on all of those areas.
Britain just went to Beijing and signed deals anyway. Not talks, not dialogue. Deals, export contracts, market access, and new working tracks that build a trade lane Washington does not control. And while London was doing that, Donald Trump was sending a very different message to another U.S. partner, Canada. Make a China deal, and I'll hit every one of your goods with a 100% tariff. Evidence. Flash 1. UK and China announced £2.2 billion export deals on Starmer's Beijing visit. One sentence. The UK government says the trip produced billions in export deals and market access wins. China extended visa-free travel, and both sides launched new economic working tracks. Evidence Flash 2. Trump threatens Canada with 100% tariffs over a China deal. One sentence. Trump publicly warned he could hit all Canadian goods with 100% tariffs if Canada makes a deal with China, framing Canada as a potential drop-off port for Chinese products. Now here's the question that should keep you watching. When U.S. allies keep doing business with China, what does Trump do next, especially with midterms around the corner? Because this isn't only a China story, it's a Western order story. Who gets to trade, who gets punished, and who gets to define what loyalty means in economic terms. Let's put the UK visit in plain terms. The UK government is framing this trip in hard numbers and hard outcomes. Billions in export deals, billions in market access wins, and practical shifts like visa-free travel that grease the wheels for business and services. Add the less flashy part, the working tracks, the feasibility work, the cooperation lanes, and you're looking at something bigger than a photo op. You're looking at infrastructure for a relationship, not military infrastructure. Commercial infrastructure, the kind that becomes harder to reverse once companies, ports, insurers, and supply chains start pricing it in. Now this is where a lot of coverage will try to trap you in a simple argument. Is Britain selling out values? That's not the point today. The point is power. In trade, power isn't only tariffs. Power is who gets access, under what conditions, and with what threat hanging over the next negotiation. So we do this the calm way, like a prosecutor. We establish what Britain actually did, what it signals, and what it triggers. First, Britain's trip is being presented as two buckets: immediate commercial outcomes and longer-term structural positioning. Immediate outcomes are the headline numbers and the deals. Structural positioning is the part that matters for geopolitics. Services, cooperation, feasibility, economic working tracks, and the kind of market access language that can later become enforceable commitments. If you're building a corridor, you don't just sign contracts. You build the machinery that keeps contracts flowing. Second, even one product-level tariff shift, like a reduction on a high-profile export, matters more than people think. Why? Because tariffs aren't only taxes, they are signals. A tariff cut lowers price, price increases volume, volume creates a business constituency, and constituencies lobby to protect the lane. That is how trade becomes political lock-in. It starts as economics and ends as leverage. Third, timing. Britain is post-Brexit and still hungry for visible trade wins. That doesn't mean Britain is naive about security risks. It means electoral politics does what it always does. It pulls governments toward growth, especially when growth is scarce and expensive. In a tight economy, a government doesn't need ideological purity. It needs a story of momentum. Now look at the wider Western context. While Washington threatens tariffs, Europe signs corridors. First Mercosur, now India. And now you have Britain building lanes too. This isn't paperwork. It's a vote of no confidence in U.S. stability. Not because allies hate America, but because they no longer trust the rules to stay still. And this is where Canada enters the story as the warning label. Canada's China arrangement, sector-specific, structured, politically explosive, triggered a public threat of 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. Not a targeted hit, not a limited response, everything. That matters because it shows the new logic. Trade is no longer being treated as mutual gain. It's being treated as discipline. Access becomes obedience. Markets become weapons. You'll hear the justification. Drop-off port. Backdoor entry, circumvention. That framing is not random. It is designed to turn a partner's sovereignty into a security breach. It makes commerce look like sabotage. It makes retaliation look like defense. It is an argument crafted for domestic politics. I'm not punishing an ally. I'm protecting the country. Once that story is accepted at home, almost any measure becomes sellable. Now ask the obvious question. If Canada can be threatened like that, what does Trump think when Britain signs deals with China? He sees three dangers. 1. Normalization. If the UK can sign deals and survive, it lowers the psychological barrier for everyone else. The taboo breaks, and once the taboo breaks, corridors multiply. 2. Precedent. If allies build viable options outside US pressure, threats lose power. Leverage only works when alternatives are scarce. 3. Midterm politics. With midterms ahead, a tariff threat isn't only a policy tool. It's an identity performance. It signals strength. It signals control. It signals I can punish. In election cycles, punishment becomes tempting because it looks decisive, especially against a convenient villain like China, and especially against partners who can be framed as careless or complicit. So the next question is practical. What measures might Washington take if the UK-China lane expands, or if more allies follow the UK's example? We don't need fantasies. We have the toolkit. 1. Rules of origin enforcement and anti-circumvention pressure. This is the silent method. Tighten documentation, slow customs clearance, increase inspections, add administrative friction that functions like an invisible tariff. You don't announce it like a trade war, you execute it like bureaucracy. And companies feel it immediately. 2. Sector targeting. Autos, steel, critical components, anything tied to integrated supply chains where pain spreads fast. If you want results, you hit the sectors that trigger lobbying inside the partner's country. 3. Threat as policy. Public threats create uncertainty. Uncertainty freezes investment. You don't always need to impose the tariff to win. You just need companies to fear it, price it, and delay decisions because the risk has become political. 4. Narrative pressure. Label a partner soft on China. Frame their trade as a security failure. Force them to spend political capital defending themselves instead of building the corridor. 5. Non-tariff leverage. With Canada, USMCA becomes a pressure field. With the UK, Washington has fewer binding trade mechanisms, but it still has procurement, defense industrial alignment, and tech restrictions, tools that become trade levers in practice. And here's the point Liberation Lens keeps returning to. These tools don't need to be fair. They need to be effective. Now, does this mean the West collapses tomorrow? No. But it does mean the West becomes internally multipolar. The US wants a bloc with one center. Europe wants autonomy. Britain wants growth. Canada wants breathing room. And China is offering selective incentives that widen the cracks without firing a shot. This is not about whether China is good. China's play here is strategic. It wants middle powers to see a contrast. When the US threatens, China reassures. When the US disciplines, China incentivizes. That is not kindness. That is design. It's a message to every middle power watching. You have options and we can price them attractively. So who wins from the UK-China lane right now? British exporters that gain tariff relief or access. Services firms if feasibility work becomes actual openings. travel and tourism if visa-free access translates into demand. China wins too, not only because of trade volume, but because every Western deal it signs is proof that full isolation isn't happening. Who loses? The US loses leverage first, not because it can't trade, because it can't discipline as easily when partners can route around the pressure. And US exporters can lose market share when competitors get preferential access in corridors the US chose not to join or can't easily control. And Canada? Canada becomes the stress test and the cautionary tale. It shows what the US is willing to threaten. It also shows why these corridors matter, because if Washington's unpredictability rises, you don't start building hedges after the fire starts. You build them before. So yes, Western trade dynamics are changing under Trump. Not because allies suddenly love China, because allies are adapting to American unpredictability. They are pricing alternatives. They are building optionality. And optionality is power for countries that are not superpowers. Now, here's what to watch next, because this is not a one-day headline. Watch whether Britain's feasibility work turns into real services commitments or stays symbolic. Watch whether Washington responds to the UK the way it responded to Canada, loud threats or quiet administrative pressure. Watch whether other allies follow, because once one core partner breaks the taboo in daylight, the herd moves. Watch US domestic politics, because midterms amplify punishment incentives, trade becomes theater, and theater becomes policy. And watch China's messaging, because when China says deals are not aimed at undermining anyone, that's not a random reassurance. That's positioning, making the US look like the destabilizer inside its own alliance network. Bottom line, the UK-China deals are not proof that Britain chose China. They're proof that allies are hedging against US volatility. And Trump's dilemma is simple. The more he uses tariffs to discipline partners, the more partners build exits, and once exits exist, threats lose power. Top one comment. Is this smart hedging or the beginning of a Western trade split? This is Liberation Lens. We report the news, then we expose the structure underneath it.